Chapter 23 of Pushing to the Front by Orison Swett Marden. Chapter 23. The Reward of Persistence. Every noble work is at first impossible. Carlyle. Victory belongs to the most persevering. Napoleon. Success in most things depends on knowing how long it takes to succeed. Montesquieu. Perpetual pushing and assurance put a difficulty out of countenance and make a seeming impossibility give way. Jeremy Collier. Unstable as water, thou shalt not excel. The nerve that never relaxes, the eye that never blanches, the thought that never wanders, these are the masters of victory. Burke. "The pit rose at me," exclaimed Edmund Kean in a wild tumult of emotion as he rushed home to his trembling wife. "Mary, you shall ride in your carriage yet, and Charles shall go to Eton." He had been so terribly in earnest with the study of his profession that he had at length made a mark on his generation. He was a little dark man with a voice naturally harsh, but he determined, when young, to play the character of Sir Giles Overreach in Massinger's drama, and no other man had ever played it. By a persistency that nothing seemed able to daunt, he so trained himself to play the character that his success, when it did come, was overwhelming, and all London was at his feet. "I am sorry to say that I don't think this is in your line," said Woodfall, the reporter, after Sheridan had made his first speech in Parliament. "You would better have stuck to your former pursuits." With head on his hand, Sheridan mused for a time, then looked up and said, "It is in me, and it shall come out of me." From the same man came that harangue against Warren Hastings, which the orator Fox called the best speech ever made in the House of Commons. "I had no other books than heaven and earth, which are open to all," said Bernard Palissy, who left his home in the south of France in 1828 at the age of 18. Though only a glass painter, he had the soul of an artist. The sight of an elegant Italian cup disturbed his whole existence, and from that moment the determination to discover the enamel with which it was glazed possessed him like a passion. For months and years he tried all kinds of experiments to learn the materials of which the enamel was composed. He built a furnace which was a failure, and then a second, burning so much wood, spoiling so many drugs and pots of common earthenware, and losing so much time that poverty stared him in the face, and he was forced, from lack of ability to buy fuel, to try his experiments in a common furnace. Flat failure was the result, but he decided on the spot to begin all over again, and soon had 300 pieces baking, one of which came out covered with beautiful enamel. To perfect his invention, he next built a glass furnace, carrying the bricks on his back. At length the time came for a trial, but though he kept the heat up 6 days, his enamel would not melt. His money was all gone, but he borrowed some, and bought more pots and wood, and tried to get a better flux. When next he lighted his fire, he attained no result until his fuel was gone. Tearing off the palings of his garden fence, he fed them to the flames, but in vain. His furniture followed to no purpose. The shelves of his pantry were then broken up and thrown into the furnace, and the great burst of heat melted the enamel. The grand secret was learned. Persistence had triumphed again. "If you work hard 2 weeks without selling a book," wrote a publisher to an agent, you will make a success of it." "Know thy work and do it," said Carlyle, "and work at it like a Hercules." Whoever is resolved to excel in painting, or indeed in any other art, said Reynolds, must bring all his mind to bear upon that one object from the moment that he rises till he goes to bed. "I have no secret but hard work," said Turner, the painter. "The man who is perpetually hesitating which of two things he will do first," said William Wirt, "will do neither. The man who resolves but suffers his resolution to be changed by the first counter-suggestion of a friend, who fluctuates from opinion to opinion, from plan to plan, and veers like a weathercock to every point of the compass, with every breath of caprice that blows, can never accomplish anything great or useful. Instead of being progressive in anything, he will be at best stationary, and, more probably, retrograde in all." Perseverance built the pyramids on Egypt's plains, erected the gorgeous temple at Jerusalem, enclosed in adamant the Chinese Empire, scaled the stormy, cloud-capped Alps, opened a highway through the watery wilderness of the Atlantic, leveled the forests of the New World, and reared in its stead a community of states and nations. Perseverance has wrought from the marble block the exquisite creations of genius, painted on canvas the gorgeous mimicry of nature, and engraved on a metallic surface the viewless substance of the shadow. Perseverance has put in motion millions of spindles, winged as many flying shuttles, harnessed thousands of iron steeds to as many freighted cars, and set them flying from town to town and nation to nation, tunneled mountains of granite, and annihilated space with the lightning's speed. It has whitened the waters of the world with the sails of 100 nations, navigated every sea and explored every land. It has reduced nature in her 1,000 forms to as many sciences, taught her laws, prophesied her future movements, measured her untrodden spaces, counted her myriad hosts of worlds, and computed their distances, dimensions, and velocities. The slow penny is surer than the quick dollar. The slow trotter will out-travel the fleet racer. Genius darts, flutters, and tires, but perseverance wears and wins. The all-day horse wins the race. The afternoon man wears off the laurels. The last blow drives home the nail. "Are your discoveries often brilliant intuitions?" asked a reporter of Thomas A. Edison. "Do they come to you while you are lying awake nights?" "I never did anything worth doing by accident," was the reply. "Nor did any of my inventions come indirectly through accident, except the phonograph. No, when I have fully decided that a result is worth getting, I go ahead on it and make trial after trial until it comes. I have always kept strictly within the lines of commercially useful inventions. I have never had any time to put on electrical wonders, valuable simply as novelties to catch the popular fancy. I like it," continued the inventor. "I don't know any other reason. Anything I have begun is always on my mind, and I am not easy while away from it until it is finished." A man who thus gives himself wholly to his work is certain to accomplish something, and if he have ability and common sense, his success will be great. how Bulwer wrestled with the fates to change his apparent destiny. His first novel was a failure, his early poems were failures, and his youthful speeches provoked the ridicule of his opponents. But he fought his way to eminence through ridicule and defeat. Gibbon worked 20 years on his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Noah Webster spent 36 years on his dictionary. What a sublime patience he showed in devoting a life to the collection and definition of words! George Bancroft spent 26 years on his History of the United States. Newton rewrote his Chronology of Ancient Nations 15 times. Titian wrote to Charles V, "I send your Majesty the Last Supper," after working on it almost daily for 7 years. He worked on his Pietro Martin 8 years. George Stephenson was 15 years perfecting his locomotive. Watt 20 years on his condensing engine. Harvey labored 8 long years before he published his discovery of the circulation of the blood. He was then called a crack-brained impostor by his fellow physicians. Amid abuse and ridicule, he waited 25 years before his great discovery was recognized by the profession. Newton discovered the law of gravitation before he was 21, but one slight error in a measurement of the Earth's circumference interfered with the demonstration of the correctness of his theory. 20 years later he corrected the error and showed that the planets roll in their orbits as a result of the same law which brings an apple to the ground. Sothern, the great actor, said that the early part of his theatrical career was spent in getting dismissed for incompetency. "Never depend upon your genius," said John Ruskin, in the words of Joshua Reynolds. "If you have talent, industry will improve it. If you have none, industry will supply the deficiency." Savages believe that when they conquer an enemy, his spirit enters into them and fights for them ever afterwards. So the spirit of our conquests enters us and helps us to win the next victory. Blucher may have been routed at Ligny yesterday, but today you hear the thunder of his guns at Waterloo hurling dismay and death among his former conquerors. Opposing circumstances create strength. Opposition gives us greater power of resistance. To overcome one barrier gives us greater ability to overcome the next. In February 1492, a poor gray-haired man, his head bowed with discouragement almost to the back of his mule, rode slowly out through the beautiful gateway of the Alhambra. From boyhood he had been haunted with the idea that the earth is round. He believed that the piece of carved wood picked up 400 miles at sea, and the bodies of 2 men unlike any other human beings known, found on the shores of Portugal, had drifted from unknown lands in the west. But his last hope of obtaining aid for a voyage of discovery had failed. King John of Portugal, while pretending to think of helping him, had sent out secretly an expedition of his own. He had begged bread, drawn maps and charts to keep from starving. He had lost his wife, his friends had called him crazy, and forsaken him. The council of wise men, called by Ferdinand and Isabella, ridiculed his theory of reaching the east by sailing west. "But the sun and moon are round," said Columbus. "Why not the earth?" "If the earth is a ball, what holds it up?" asked the wise men. "What holds the sun and moon up?" inquired Columbus. "But how can men walk with their heads down and their feet up?" like flies on a ceiling?" asked a learned doctor. "How can trees grow with their roots in the air?" "The water would run out of the ponds and we should fall off," said another philosopher. This doctrine is contrary to the Bible, which says, "The heavens are stretched out like a tent. Of course it is flat. It is rank heresy to say it is round," said a priest. Columbus left the Alhambra in despair, intending to offer his services to Charles VII, but he heard a voice calling his name. An old friend had told Isabella that it would add great renown to her reign at a trifling expense if what the sailor believed should prove true. "It shall be done," said Isabella. "I will pledge my jewels to raise the money. Call him back." Columbus turned, and with him turned the world. Not a sailor would go voluntarily, so the king and queen compelled them. 3 days out in his vessels, scarcely larger than fishing schooners, the Pinta floated a signal of distress for a broken rudder. Terror seized the sailors, but Columbus calmed their fears with pictures of gold and precious stones from India. 200 miles west of the Canaries, the compass ceased to point to the North Star. The sailors are ready to mutiny, but he tells them the North Star is not exactly north. 2,300 miles from home, though he tells them it is but 1,700. A bush with berries floats by. Land birds fly near, and they pick up a piece of wood curiously carved. On October 12th, Columbus raised the banner of Castile over the Western world. "How hard I worked at that tremendous shorthand, and all improvement appertaining to it," said Dickens. "I will only add to what I have already written of my perseverance at this time of my life, and of a patient and continuous energy which then began to be matured." Cyrus W. Field had retired from business with a large fortune when he became possessed with the idea that by means of a cable laid upon the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, telegraphic communication could be established between Europe and America. He plunged into the undertaking with all the force of his being. The preliminary work included the construction of a telegraph line 1,000 miles long, from New York to St. John's, Newfoundland. Through 400 miles of almost unbroken forest they had to build a road, as well as a telegraph line, across Newfoundland. Another stretch of 140 miles across the island of Cape Breton involved a great deal of labor, as did the laying of a cable across the St. Lawrence. By hard work, he secured aid for his company from the British government, but in Congress he encountered such bitter opposition from a powerful lobby that his measure only had a majority of 1 in the Senate. The cable was loaded upon the Agamemnon, the flagship of the British fleet at Sebastopol, and upon the Niagara, a magnificent new frigate of the United States Navy. But when 5 miles of cable had been paid out, it caught in the machinery and parted. On a second trial, when 200 miles at sea, the electric current was suddenly lost, and men paced the decks nervously and sadly, as if in the presence of death. Just as Mr. Field was about to give the order to cut the cable, the current returned as quickly and mysteriously as it had disappeared. The following night, when the ship was moving but 4 miles an hour, and the cable running out at the rate of 6 miles, the brakes were applied too suddenly, just as the steamer gave a heavy lurch, breaking the cable. Field was not the man to give up, 700 miles more of cable were ordered, and a man of great skill was set to work to devise a better machine for paying out the long line. American and British inventors united in making a machine. At length, in mid-ocean, the two halves of the cable were spliced and the steamers began to separate. The one headed for Ireland, the other for Newfoundland, each running out the precious thread, which it was hoped would bind two continents together. Before the vessels were 3 miles apart, the cable parted. Again it was spliced, but when the ships were 80 miles apart, the current was lost. A third time the cable was spliced, and about 200 miles paid out, when it parted some 20 feet from the Agamemnon, and the vessels returned to the coast of Ireland. Directors were disheartened, the public skeptical, capitalists were shy, and but for the indomitable energy and persuasiveness of Mr. Field, who worked day and night, almost without food or sleep, the whole project would have been abandoned. Finally, a third attempt was made, with such success that the whole cable was laid without a break, and several messages were flashed through nearly 700 leagues of ocean, when suddenly the current ceased. Faith now seemed dead, except in the breast of Cyrus W. Field and one or two friends. Yet with such persistence did they work that they persuaded men to furnish capital for yet another trial, even against what seemed their better judgment. A new and superior cable was loaded upon the Great Eastern, which steamed slowly out to sea, paying out as she advanced. Everything worked to a charm until within 600 miles of Newfoundland, when the cable snapped and sank. After several attempts to raise it, the enterprise was abandoned for a year. Not discouraged by all these difficulties, Mr. Field went to work with a will, organized a new company, and made a new cable far superior to anything before used. And on July 13, 1866, was begun the trial which ended with the following message sent to New York. Heart's Content, July 27. We arrived here at 9 o'clock this morning. All well. Thank God, the cable is laid and is in perfect working order. Cyrus W. Field. The old cable was picked up, spliced, and continued to Newfoundland, and the two are still working, with good prospects for usefulness for many years. In Revelation we read, "He that overcometh, I will give him to sit down with me on my throne." Successful men, it is said, owe more to their perseverance than to their natural powers, their friends, or the favorable circumstances around them. Genius will falter by the side of labor. Great powers will yield to great industry. Talent is desirable, but perseverance is more so. "How long did it take you to learn to play?" asked a young man of Gerardini. 12 hours a day for 20 years, replied the great violinist. Lyman Beecher, when asked how long it took him to write his celebrated sermon on the government of God, replied, "About 40 years." A Chinese student, discouraged by repeated failures, had thrown away his book in despair, when he saw a poor woman rubbing an iron bar on a stone to make a needle. This example of patience sent him back to his studies with a new determination, and he became one of the 3 greatest scholars of China. Malibran said, "If I neglect my practice a day, I see the difference in my execution. If for 2 days, my friends see it. And if for a week, all the world knows my failure." Constant, persistent struggle she found to be the price of her marvelous power. When an East India boy is learning archery, he is compelled to practice 3 months drawing the string to his ear before he is allowed to touch an arrow. Benjamin Franklin had this tenacity of purpose in a wonderful degree. When he started in the printing business in Philadelphia, he carried his material through the streets on a wheelbarrow. He hired one room for his office, workroom, and sleeping room. He found a formidable rival in the city and invited him to his room. Pointing to a piece of bread from which he had just eaten his dinner, he said, "Unless you can live cheaper than I can, you cannot starve me out." All are familiar with the misfortune of Carlyle while writing his History of the French Revolution. After the first volume was ready for the press, he loaned the manuscript to a neighbor, who left it lying on the floor, and the servant girl took it to kindle the fire. It was a bitter disappointment, but Carlyle was not the man to give up. After many months of poring over hundreds of volumes of authorities and scores of manuscripts, he reproduced that which had burned in a few minutes. Audubon, the naturalist, had spent 2 years with his gun and notebook in the forests of America, making drawings of birds. He nailed them all up securely in a box and went off on a vacation. When he returned, he opened the box, only to find a nest of Norwegian rats in his beautiful drawings. Everyone was ruined. It was a terrible disappointment. But Audubon took his gun and notebook and started for the forest. He reproduced his drawings, and they were even better than the first. When Dickens was asked to read one of his selections in public, he replied that he had not time, for he was in the habit of reading the same piece every day for 6 months before reading it in public. "My own invention," he says, "such as it is, I assure you, would never have served me, as it has but for the habit of commonplace, humble, patient, toiling attention." Addison amassed 3 volumes of manuscript before he began the Spectator. Everyone admires a determined, persistent man. Marcus Morton ran 16 times for governor of Massachusetts. At last, his opponents voted for him from admiration of his pluck, and he was elected by a majority of 1. Such persistence always triumphs. Webster declared that when a pupil at Phillips Exeter Academy, he never could declaim before the school. He said he committed piece after piece and rehearsed them in his room. But when he heard his name called in the academy and all eyes turned towards him, the room became dark, and everything he ever knew fled from his brain. But he became the great orator of America. Indeed, it is doubtful whether Demosthenes himself surpassed his great reply to Hayne in the United States Senate. Webster's tenacity was illustrated by a circumstance which occurred in the academy. The principal punished him for shooting pigeons by compelling him to commit 100 lines of Virgil. He knew the principal was to take a certain train that afternoon, so he went to his room and learned 700 lines. He went to recite them to the principal just before train time. After repeating the 100 lines, he continued until he had recited 200. The principal anxiously looked at his watch and grew nervous, but Webster kept right on. The principal finally stopped him and asked him how many more he had learned. About 500 more, said Webster, continuing to recite. You can have the rest of the day for pigeon shooting, said the principal. Great writers have ever been noted for their tenacity of purpose. Their works have not been flung off from minds aglow with genius, but have been elaborated and elaborated into grace and beauty until every trace of their efforts has been obliterated. Bishop Butler worked 20 years incessantly on his Analogy, and even then was so dissatisfied that he wanted to burn it. Rousseau says he obtained the ease and grace of his style only by ceaseless inquietude, by endless blotches and erasures. Virgil worked 11 years on the Aeneid. The notebooks of great men like Hawthorne and Emerson are telltales of the enormous drudgery of the years put into a book which may be read in an hour. Montesquieu was 25 years writing his Esprit des Lois, yet you can read it in 60 minutes. Adam Smith spent 10 years on his Wealth of Nations. A rival playwright once laughed at Euripides for spending 3 days on 3 lines, when he had written 500 lines. But your 500 lines in 3 days will be dead and forgotten, while my 3 lines will live forever, he replied. Ariosto wrote his Description of a Tempest in 16 different ways. He spent 10 years on his Orlando Furioso, and only sold 100 copies at 15 pence each. The proof of Burke's Letters to a Noble Lord, one of the sublimest things in all literature, went back to the publisher so changed and blotted with corrections that the printer absolutely refused to correct it, and it was entirely reset. Adam Tucker spent 18 years on the Light of Nature. Thoreau's New England Pastoral, A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, was an entire failure. 700 of the 1,000 copies printed were returned from the publishers. Thoreau wrote in his diary, "I have some 900 volumes in my library, 700 of which I wrote myself." Yet he took up his pen with as much determination as ever. The rolling stone gathers no moss. The persistent tortoise outruns the swift but fickle hare. An hour a day for 12 years more than equals the time given to study in a 4 years course at a high school. The reading and rereading of a single volume has been the making of many a man. Patience, says Bulwer, is the courage of the conqueror. It is the virtue par excellence of man against destiny, of the one against the world, and of the soul against matter. Therefore, this is the courage of the gospel, and its importance in a social view, its importance to races and institutions, cannot be too earnestly inculcated. Want of constancy is the cause of many a failure, making the millionaire of today a beggar tomorrow. Show me a really great triumph that is not the reward of persistence. One of the paintings which made Titian famous was on his easel 8 years, another 7. How came popular writers famous? By writing for years without any pay at all, by writing hundreds of pages as mere practice work, by working like galley slaves at literature for half a lifetime with no other compensation than fame. Never despair, says Burke. But if you do, work on in despair. The head of the god Hercules is represented as covered with a lion's skin, with claws joined under the chin, to show that when we have conquered our misfortunes, they become our helpers. Oh, the glory of an unconquerable will! End of chapter 23. The Reward of Persistence. Chapter 24 of Pushing to the Front by Orison Swett Marden. Chapter 24. Nerve, grip, pluck. Never give up, for the wisest is boldest, knowing that Providence mingles the cup, and of all maxims the best, as the oldest, is the stern watchword of never give up. Be firm. One constant element of luck is genuine, solid, old Teutonic pluck. Stick to your aim, the mongrel's hold will slip, but only crowbars lose the bulldog's grip. Small though he looks, the jaw that never yields drags down the bellowing monarch of the fields. Holmes. Soldiers, you are Frenchmen, said Napoleon, coolly walking among his disaffected generals when they threatened his life in the Egyptian campaign. You are too many to assassinate, and too few to intimidate me. How brave he is, exclaimed the ringleader, as he withdrew, completely cowed. General Taylor never surrenders, said old Rough and Ready at Buena Vista, when Santa Anna, with 20,000 men, offered him a chance to save his 4,000 soldiers by capitulation. The battle was long and desperate, but at length the Mexicans were glad to avoid further defeat by flight. When Lincoln was asked how Grant impressed him as a general, he replied, "The greatest thing about him is cool persistency of purpose. He has the grip of a bulldog. When he once gets his teeth in, nothing can shake him off." It was "on to Richmond," and "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer," that settled the fate of the rebellion. "My sword is too short," said a Spartan youth to his father. "Add a step to it, then," was the only reply. It is said that the snapping turtle will not release his grip even after his head is cut off. He is resolved, if he dies, to die hard. It is just such grit that enables men to succeed. For what is called luck is generally the prerogative of valiant souls. It is the final effort that brings victory. It is the last pull of the oar, with clenched teeth and knit muscles, that shows what Oxford boatmen call the beefiness of the fellow. After Grant's defeat at the first battle of Shiloh, nearly every newspaper of both parties in the North, almost every member of Congress, and public sentiment everywhere demanded his removal. Friends of the President pleaded with him to give the command to someone else, for his own sake as well as for the good of the country. Lincoln listened for hours one night, speaking only at rare intervals to tell a pithy story, until the clock struck 1. Then, after a long silence, he said, "I can't spare this man. He fights." It was Lincoln's marvelous insight and sagacity that saved Grant from the storm of popular passion and gave us the greatest hero of the Civil War. It is this keeping right on that wins in the battle of life. Grant never looked backward. Once, after several days of hard fighting without definite result, he called a council of war. One general described the route by which he would retreat, another thought it better to retire by a different road, and general after general told how he would withdraw, or fall back, or seek a more favorable position in the rear. At length all eyes were turned upon Grant, who had been a silent listener for hours. He rose, took a bundle of papers from an inside pocket, handed one to each general, and said, "Gentlemen, at dawn you will execute those orders." Every paper gave definite directions for an advance, and with the morning sun the army moved forward to victory. Massena's army of 18,000 men in Genoa had been reduced by fighting and famine to 8,000. They had killed and captured more than 15,000 Austrians, but their provisions were completely exhausted. Starvation stared them in the face. The enemy outnumbered them 4-1, and they seemed at the mercy of their opponents. General Ott demanded a discretionary surrender, but Massena replied, "My soldiers must be allowed to march out with colors flying, and arms and baggage, not as prisoners of war, but free to fight when and where we please. If you do not grant this, I will sally forth from Genoa sword in hand. With 8,000 famished men, I will attack your camp, and I will fight till I cut my way through it." Ott knew the temper of the great soldier, and agreed to accept the terms if he would surrender himself, or if he would depart by sea, so as not to be quickly joined by reinforcements. Massena's only reply was, "Take my terms, or I will cut my way through your army." Ott at last agreed, when Massena said, "I give you notice that ere 15 days are past, I shall be once more in Genoa." And he kept his word. Napoleon said of this man, who was orphaned in infancy and cast upon the world to make his own way in life, when defeated, Massena was always ready to fight a battle over again, as though he had been the conqueror. "The battle is completely lost," said Desaix, looking at his watch, when consulted by Napoleon at Marengo. "But it is only 2 o'clock, and we shall have time to gain another." He then made his famous cavalry charge, and won the field, although a few minutes before the French soldiers all along the line were momentarily expecting an order to retreat. "Well," said Barnum to a friend in 1841, "I am going to buy the American Museum." "Buy it!" exclaimed the astonished friend, who knew that the showman had not $1. "What do you intend buying it with?" "Brass," was the prompt reply. "For silver and gold have I none." Everyone interested in public entertainments in New York knew Barnum, and knew the condition of his pocket. But Francis Olmsted, who owned the museum building, consulted numerous references, all telling of a good showman who would do as he agreed, and accepted a proposition to give security for the purchaser. Mr. Olmsted was to appoint a money taker at the door, and credit Barnum towards the purchase with all above expenses, and an allowance of $50 per month to support his wife and 3 children. Mrs. Barnum assented to the arrangement, and offered to cut down the household expenses to a little more than $1 a day. 6 months later, Mr. Olmsted entered the ticket office at noon, and found Barnum eating for dinner a few slices of bread and some corned beef. "Is this the way you eat your dinner?" he asked. "I have not eaten a warm dinner since I bought the museum, except on the Sabbath, and I intend never to eat another until I get out of debt. "Ah, you are safe, and will pay for the museum before the year is out," said Mr. Olmsted, slapping the young man approvingly on the shoulder. He was right, for in less than a year Barnum had paid every cent out of the profits of the establishment. "Hard pounding, gentlemen," said Wellington at Waterloo to his officers, "but we will see who can pound the longest." "It is very kind of them to sand our letters for us," said young Junot coolly, as an Austrian shell scattered earth over the dispatch he was writing at the dictation of his commander-in-chief. The remark attracted Napoleon's attention and led to the promotion of the scrivener. "There is room enough up higher," said Webster to a young man hesitating to study law because the profession was so crowded. This is true in every department of activity. The young man who succeeds must hold his ground and push hard. Whoever attempts to pass through the door to success will find it labeled "push." There is another big word in the English language. The perfection of grit is the power of saying "no" with emphasis that cannot be mistaken. Learn to meet hard times with a harder will and more determined pluck. The nature which is all pine and straw is of no use in times of trial. We must have some oak and iron in us. The goddess of fame or of fortune has been won by many a poor boy who had no friends, no backing, or anything but pure grit and invincible purpose. A good character, good habits, and iron industry are impregnable to the assaults of the ill luck that fools are dreaming of. There is no luck, for all practical purposes, to him who is not striving, and whose senses are not all eagerly attent. What are called accidental discoveries are almost invariably made by those who are looking for something. A man incurs about as much risk of being struck by lightning as by accidental luck. There is perhaps an element of luck in the amount of success which crowns the efforts of different men. But even here it will usually be found that the sagacity with which the efforts are directed, and the energy with which they are prosecuted, measure pretty accurately the luck contained in the results achieved. Apparent exceptions will be found to relate almost wholly to single undertakings, while in the long run the rule will hold good. Two pearl divers, equally expert, dive together and work with equal energy. One brings up a pearl, while the other returns empty-handed. But let both persevere, and at the end of 5, 10, or 20 years, it will be found that they succeeded almost in exact proportion to their skill and industry. Varied experience of men has led me, the longer I live, says Huxley, to set less value on mere cleverness, to attach more and more importance to industry and physical endurance. Indeed, I am much disposed to think that endurance is the most valuable quality of all, for industry, as the desire to work hard, does not come to much if a feeble frame is unable to respond to the desire. No life is wasted unless it ends in sloth, dishonesty, or cowardice. No success is worthy of the name unless it is won by honest industry and brave breasting of the waves of fortune. Has luck ever made a fool speak words of wisdom? An ignoramus utter lectures on science? A dolt write an Odyssey, an Aeneid, a Paradise Lost, or a Hamlet? A loafer become a Gerard or Astor, a Rothschild, Stuart, Vanderbilt, Field, Gould, or Rockefeller? A coward win at Yorktown, Wagram, Waterloo or Richmond, a careless stone cutter carve an Apollo, a Minerva, a Venus de Medici, or a Greek slave? Does luck raise rich crops on the land of the sluggard, weeds and brambles on that of the industrious farmer? Does luck make the drunkard sleek and attractive, and his home cheerful, while the temperate man looks haggard and suffers want and misery? Does luck starve honest labor and pamper idleness? Does luck put common sense at a discount, folly at a premium? Does it cast intelligence into the gutter and raise ignorance to the skies? Does it imprison virtue and laud vice? Did luck give Watt his engine, Franklin his captive lightning, Whitney his cotton gin, Fulton his steamboat, Morse his telegraph, Blanchard his lathe, Howe his sewing machine, Goodyear his rubber, Bell his telephone, Edison his phonograph? If you are told of the man who, worn out by a painful disorder, tried to commit suicide, but only opened an internal tumor, effecting a cure; of the Persian condemned to lose his tongue, on whom a bungling operation merely removed an impediment of speech; of a painter who produced an effect long desired by throwing his brush at a picture in rage and despair; of a musician who, after repeated failures in trying to imitate a storm at sea, obtained the result desired by angrily running his hands together from the extremities of the keyboard. Bear in mind that even this luck came to men as the result of action, not inaction. Luck is ever waiting for something to turn up, says Cobden. Labor with keen eyes and strong will turn up something. Luck lies in bed and wishes the postman would bring him the news of a legacy. Labor turns out at 6 o'clock, and with busy pen or ringing hammer lays the foundation of a competence. Luck whines, labor whistles. Luck relies on chance, labor on character. Stick to the thing and carry it through. Believe you were made for the place you fill, and that no one else can fill it as well. Put forth your whole energies. Be awake. Electrify yourself. Go forth to the task. Only once learn to carry a thing through in all its completeness and proportion, and you will become a hero. You will think better of yourself. Others will think better of you. The world in its very heart admires the stern, determined doer. I like the man who faces what he must, with step triumphant and a heart of cheer, who fights the daily battle without fear, sees his hopes fail, yet keeps unfaltering trust, that God is God, that somehow, true and just, his plans work out for mortals. Not a tear is shed when fortune, which the world holds dear, falls from his grasp. Better with love a crust than living in dishonor, envies not, nor loses faith in man, but does his best, nor even murmurs at his humbler lot, but with a smile and words of hope gives jest. To every toiler he alone is great, who by a life heroic conquers fate. End of chapter 24. Nerve, grit, pluck. Chapter 25 of Pushing to the Front by Orison Swett Marden. Chapter 25. Clear Grit. Let fortune empty her whole quiver on me, I have a soul that, like an ample shield, can take in all, and verge enough for more. Dryden. There's a brave fellow, there's a man of pluck, a man who's not afraid to say his say, though a whole town's against him. Longfellow. Our greatest glory is not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. Goldsmith. The barriers are not yet erected which shall say to aspiring talent, thus far and no farther. Beethoven. Friends and comrades, said Pizarro, as he turned toward the south, after tracing with his sword upon the sand a line from east to west. On that side are toil, hunger, nakedness, the drenching storm, desertion and death. On this side, ease and pleasure. There lies Peru with its riches, here Panama and its poverty. Choose each man what best becomes a brave Castilian. For my part, I go to the south. So saying, he crossed the line and was followed by 13 Spaniards in armor. Thus, on the little island of Gallo in the Pacific, when his men were clamoring to return to Panama, did Pizarro and his fellow volunteers resolve to stake their lives upon the success of a desperate crusade against the powerful empire of the Incas. At the time, they had not even a vessel to transport them to the country they wished to conquer. Is it necessary to add that all difficulties yielded at last to such resolute determination? Perseverance is a Roman virtue that wins each godlike act and plucks success even from the spear-proof crest of rugged danger. When you get into a tight place and everything goes against you, till it seems as if you could not hold on a minute longer, said Harriet Beecher Stowe, never give up, for that's just the place and time that the tide'll turn. Charles Sumner said, 3 things are necessary to a strong character. First, backbone. Second, backbone. Third, backbone. While digging among the ruins of Pompeii, which was buried by the dust and ashes from an eruption of Vesuvius, A.D. 79, the workmen found the skeleton of a Roman soldier in the sentry box at one of the city's gates. He might have found safety under sheltering rocks close by, but, in the face of certain death, he had remained at his post, a mute witness to the thorough discipline, the ceaseless vigilance and fidelity which made the Roman legionaries masters of the known world. The world admires the man who never flinches from unexpected difficulties, who calmly, patiently, and courageously grapples with his fate, who dies, if need be, at his post. Clear grit always commands respect. It is that quality which achieves, and everybody admires achievement. In the strife of parties and principles, backbone without brains will carry against brains without backbone. You cannot, by tying an opinion to a man's tongue, make him the representative of that opinion. At the close of any battle for principles, his name will be found neither among the dead nor among the wounded, but among the missing. The London Times was an insignificant sheet published by Mr. Walter, and was steadily losing money. John Walter, Jr., then only 27 years old, begged his father to give him full control of the paper. After many misgivings, the father finally consented. The young journalist began to remodel the establishment, and to introduce new ideas everywhere. The paper had not attempted to mold public opinion. and had had no individuality or character of its own. The audacious young editor boldly attacked every wrong, even the government, whenever he thought it corrupt. Thereupon the public customs, printing, and the government advertisements were withdrawn. The father was in utter dismay. His son, he was sure, would ruin the paper and himself, but no remonstrance could swerve the son from his purpose to give the world a great journal which should have weight, character, individuality, and independence. The public soon saw that a new power stood behind the Times, that its articles meant business, that new life and new blood and new ideas had been infused into the insignificant sheet, that a man with brains and push and tenacity of purpose stood at the helm, a man who could make a way when he could not find one. Among other new features, foreign dispatches were introduced, and they appeared in the Times several days before their appearance in the government organs. The leading article also was introduced to stay. The aggressive editor antagonized the government, and his foreign dispatches were all stopped at the outposts, while the ministerial journalists were allowed to proceed. But nothing could daunt this resolute young spirit. At enormous expense, he employed special couriers. Every obstacle put in his way, and all opposition from the government, only added to his determination to succeed. Enterprise, push, grit were behind the Times, and nothing could stay its progress. Young Walter was the soul of the paper, and his personality pervaded every detail. In those days, only 300 copies of the paper could be struck off in an hour by the best presses, and Walter had duplicate and even triplicate types set. Then he set his brain to work, and finally the Walter Press, throwing off 17,000 copies per hour, both sides printed, was the result. It was the 29th of November, 1814, that the first steam-printed paper was given to the world. Mean natures always feel a sort of terror before great natures, and many a base thought has been unuttered, many a sneaking vote withheld, through the fear inspired by the rebuking presence of one noble man. As a result, pure grit, character, has the right of way. In the presence of men permeated with grit and sound in character, meanness and baseness slink out of sight. Mean men are uncomfortable, dishonesty trembles, hypocrisy is uncertain. Lincoln, being asked by an anxious visitor what he would do after 3 or 4 years if the rebellion were not subdued, replied, "Oh, there is no alternative but to keep pegging away." "It is in me, and it shall come out," said Sheridan, when told that he would never make an orator as he had failed in his first speech in Parliament. He became known as one of the foremost orators of his day. When a boy, Henry Clay was very bashful and diffident, and scarcely dared recite before his class at school, but he determined to become an orator. So he committed speeches and recited them in the cornfields, or in the barn, with the horse and cows for an audience. If impossibilities ever exist, popularly speaking, they ought to have been found somewhere between the birth and death of Kitto, that deaf pauper and master of Oriental learning. But Kitto did not find them there. In the presence of his decision and imperial energy, they melted away. He begged his father to take him out of the poor house, even if he had to subsist like the Hottentots. He told him that he would sell his books and pawn his handkerchief, by which he thought he could raise about 12 shillings. He said he could live upon blackberries, nuts, and field turnips, and was willing to sleep on a hayrick. Here was real grit. What were impossibilities to such a resolute, indomitable will? Grit is a permanent, solid quality which enters into the very structure, the very tissues of the Constitution. Many of our generals in the Civil War exhibited heroism. They were plucky and often displayed great determination. But Grant had pure grit in the most concentrated form. He could not be moved from his base. He was self-centered, immovable. If you try to wheedle out of him his plans for a campaign, he stolidly smokes. If you call him an imbecile and a blunderer, he blandly lights another cigar. If you praise him as the greatest general living, he placidly returns the puff from his regalia. If you tell him he should run for the presidency, it does not disturb the equanimity with which he inhales and exhales the unsubstantial vapor which typifies the politician's promises. While you are wondering what kind of creature this man without a tongue is, you are suddenly electrified with the news of some splendid victory, proving that behind the cigar and behind the face discharged of all telltale expression is the best brain to plan and the strongest heart to dare among the generals of the Republic. Lincoln had pure grit. When the illustrated papers everywhere were caricaturing him, when no epithet seemed too harsh to heap upon him, when his methods were criticized by his own party, and the generals in the war were denouncing his foolish confidence in Grant, and delegations were waiting upon him to ask for that general's removal, the great president sat with crossed legs and was reminded of a story. Lincoln and Grant both had that rare nerve which cares not for ridicule, is not swerved by public clamor, can bear abuse and hatred. There is a mighty force in truth, and in the sublime conviction and supreme self-confidence behind it, in the knowledge that truth is mighty and the conviction and confidence that it will prevail. Pure grit is that element of character which enables a man to clutch his aim with an iron grip and keep the needle of his purpose pointing to the star of his hope. Through sunshine and storm, through hurricane and tempest, through sleet and rain, with a leaky ship, with a crew in mutiny, it perseveres. In fact, nothing but death can subdue it, and it dies still struggling. The man of grit carries in his very presence a power which controls and commands. He is spared the necessity of declaring himself, for his grit speaks in his every act. It does not come by fits and starts. It is a part of his life. It inspires a sublime audacity and a heroic courage. Many of the failures of life are due to the want of grit or business nerve. It is unfortunate for a young man to start out in business life with a weak, yielding disposition, with no resolution or backbone to mark his own course and stick to it, with no ability to say "no" with an emphasis, obliging this man by investing in hopeless speculation, and, rather than offend a friend, endorsing a questionable note. A little boy was asked how he learned to skate. "Oh, by getting up every time I fell down," he replied. Whipple tells a story of Messenia, which illustrates the masterful purpose that plucks victory out of the jaws of defeat. After the defeat at Essling, the success of Napoleon's attempt to withdraw his beaten army depended on the character of Messenia, to whom the emperor dispatched a messenger, telling him to keep his position for 2 hours longer at Aspern. This order, couched in the form of a request, required almost an impossibility. But Napoleon knew the indomitable tenacity of the man to whom he gave it. The messenger found Messenia seated on a heap of rubbish, his eyes bloodshot, his frame weakened by his unparalleled exertion during a contest of 40 hours, and his whole appearance indicating a physical state better befitting the hospital than the field. But that steadfast soul seemed altogether unaffected by bodily prostration. Half dead as he was with fatigue, he rose painfully and said courageously, "Tell the emperor that I will hold out for 2 hours." And he kept his word. "Often defeated in battle," said Macaulay of Alexander the Great, "he was always successful in war." In the Battle of Marengo, the Austrians considered the day won. The French army was inferior in numbers and had given way. The Austrian army extended its wings on the right and on the left to follow up the French. Then, though the French themselves thought that the battle was lost, and the Austrians were confident it was won, Napoleon gave the command to charge, and, the trumpet's blast being given, the Old Guard charged down into the weakened center of the enemy, cut it in two, rolled the two wings up on either side, and the battle was won for France. Once, when Marshal Ney was going into battle, looking down at his knees which were smiting together, he said, "You may well shake. You would shake worse yet if you knew where I am going to take you." It is victory after victory with the soldier, lesson after lesson with the scholar, blow after blow with the laborer, crop after crop with the farmer, picture after picture with the painter, and mile after mile with the traveler, that secures what all so much desire: success. A promising Harvard student was stricken with paralysis of both legs. Physicians said there was no hope for him. The lad determined to continue his college studies. The examiners heard him at his bedside, and in 4 years he took his degree. He resolved to make a critical study of Dante, to which he had to learn Italian and German. He persevered in spite of repeated attacks of illness and partial loss of sight. He was competing for the university prize. Think of the paralytic lad, helpless in bed, competing for a prize, fighting death inch by inch. What a lesson! Before his manuscript was published or the prize awarded, the brave student died, but his work was successful. Congressman William W. Crapo, while working his way through college, being too poor to buy a dictionary, actually copied one. Walking from his home in the village of Dartmouth, Massachusetts, to New Bedford, to replenish his store of words and definitions from the town library. Oh, the triumphs of this indomitable spirit of the conqueror! This it was that enabled Franklin to dine on a small loaf in the printing office with a book in his hand. It helped Locke to live on bread and water in a Dutch garret. It enabled Gideon Lee to go barefoot in the snow, half starved and thinly clad. It sustained Lincoln and Garfield on their hard journeys from the log cabin to the White House. President Chadbourne put grit in place of his lost lung, and worked 35 years after his funeral had been planned. Henry Fawcett put grit in place of eyesight, and became the greatest postmaster general England ever had. Prescott also put grit in place of eyesight, and became one of America's greatest historians. Francis Parkman put grit in place of health and eyesight, and became the greatest historian of America in his line. Thousands of men have put grit in place of health, eyes, ears, hands, legs, and yet have achieved marvelous success. Indeed, most of the great things of the world have been accomplished by grit and pluck. You cannot keep a man down who has these qualities. He will make stepping stones out of his stumbling blocks, and lift himself to success. At 50, Barnum was a ruined man, owing thousands more than he possessed. Yet he resolutely resumed business once more, fairly wringing success from adverse fortune, and paying his notes at the same time. Again and again he was ruined, but phoenix-like, he rose repeatedly from the ashes of his misfortune, each time more determined than before. "It is all very well," said Charles J. Fox, "to tell me that a young man has distinguished himself by a brilliant first speech. He may go on, or he may be satisfied with his first triumph. But show me a young man who has not succeeded at first, and nevertheless has gone on, and I will back that young man to do better than most of those who have succeeded at the first trial." Cobden broke down completely the first time he appeared on a platform in Manchester, and the chairman apologized for him. But he did not give up speaking till every poor man in England had a larger, better, and cheaper loaf. See young Disraeli, sprung from a hated and persecuted race, without opportunity, pushing his way up through the middle classes, up through the upper classes, until he stands self-poised upon the topmost round of political and social power, scoffed, ridiculed, rebuffed, hissed from the House of Commons. He simply says, "The time will come when you will hear me." The time did come, and the boy with no chance swayed the scepter of England for a quarter of a century. One of the most remarkable examples in history is Disraeli, forcing his leadership upon that very party whose prejudices were deepest against his race, and which had an utter contempt for self-made men and interlopers. Imagine England's surprise when she awoke to find this insignificant Hebrew actually Chancellor of the Exchequer. He was easily master of all the tortures supplied by the armory of rhetoric. He could exhaust the resources of the bitterest invective. He could sting Gladstone out of his self-control. He was absolute master of himself and his situation. You could see that this young man intended to make his way in the world. Determined audacity was in his very face. Handsome, with the hated Hebrew blood in his veins, after 3 defeats in parliamentary elections, he was not the least daunted, for he knew his day would come. Lord Melbourne, the great Prime Minister, when this gay young fop was introduced to him, asked him what he wished to be. "Prime Minister of England," was his audacious reply. William H. Seward was given $1,000 by his father with which to go to college. This was all he was to have. The son returned at the end of the freshman year with extravagant habits and no money. His father refused to give him more, and told him he could not stay at home. When the youth found the props all taken out from under him, and that he must now sink or swim, he left home moneyless, returned to college, graduated at the head of his class, studied law, was elected governor of New York, and became Lincoln's great Secretary of State during the Civil War. Garfield said, "If the power to do hard work is not talent, it is the best possible substitute for it." The triumph of industry and grit over low birth and iron fortune in America, the land of opportunity, ought to be sufficient to put to shame all grumblers over their hard fortune, and those who attempt to excuse aimless, shiftless, successless men because they have no chance. During a winter in the War of 1812, General Jackson's troops, unprovided for and starving, became mutinous and were going home. But the general set the example of living on acorns, and then he rode before the rebellious line and threatened with instant death the first mutineer that should try to leave. The race is not always to the swift. The battle is not always to the strong. Horses are sometimes weighted or hampered in the race, and this is taken into account in the result. So, in the race of life, the distance alone does not determine the prize. We must take into consideration the hindrances, the weights we have carried, the disadvantages of education, of breeding, of training, of surroundings, of circumstances. How many young men are weighted down with debt, with poverty, with the support of invalid parents or brothers and sisters or friends? How many are fettered with ignorance, hampered by inhospitable surroundings, with the opposition of parents who do not understand them? How many a round boy is hindered in the race by being forced into a square hole? How many youths are delayed in their course because nobody believes in them, because nobody encourages them, because they get no sympathy and are forever tortured for not doing that against which every fiber of their being protests, and every drop of their blood rebels? How many men have to feel their way to the goal through the blindness of ignorance and lack of experience? How many go bungling along from the lack of early discipline and drill in the vocation they have chosen? How many have to hobble along on crutches because they were never taught to help themselves, but have been accustomed to lean upon a father's wealth or a mother's indulgence? How many are weakened for the journey of life by self-indulgence, by dissipation, by life sappers? How many are crippled by disease, by a weak constitution, by impaired eyesight or hearing? When the prizes of life shall be finally awarded, the distance we have run, the weights we have carried, the handicaps, will all be taken into account. Not the distance we have run, but the obstacles we have overcome, the disadvantages under which we have made the race, will decide the prizes. The poor wretch who has plodded along against unknown temptations, the poor woman who has buried her sorrows in her silent heart and sewed her weary way through life, those who have suffered abuse in silence, and who have been unrecognized or despised by their fellow runners, will often receive the greater prize. The wise and active conquer difficulties by daring to attempt them. Sloth and folly shiver and sink at sight of toil and hazard, and make the impossibility they fear. "I can't. It is impossible," said a foiled lieutenant to Alexander. "Begone!" shouted the conquering Macedonian. "There is nothing impossible to him who will try." Were I called upon to express in a word the secret of so many failures among those who started out in life with high hopes, I should say unhesitatingly, they lacked willpower. They could not half will. What is a man without a will? He is like an engine without steam, a mere sport of chance, to be tossed about hither and thither, always at the mercy of those who have wills. I should call the strength of will the test of a young man's possibilities. Can he will strong enough, and hold whatever he undertakes with an iron grip? It is the iron grip that takes the stronghold on life. What chance is there in this crowding, pushing, selfish, greedy world, where everything is pusher or pushed, for a young man with no will, no grip on life? "The truest wisdom," said Napoleon, "is a resolute determination. An iron will without principle might produce a Napoleon, but with character it would make a Wellington or a Grant, untarnished by ambition or avarice. The undivided will, 'tis that compels the elements and wrings a human music from the indifferent air." End of chapter 25. Clear Grit.